Only recently did I come to the realization, not through my own devices, but through somebody else sort of nudging me in that direction, that my own father was abusive. Just to show how difficult it can be from when you're inside an abusive relationship to recognize it. Today, we're going to talk about how an abuser, a person that is abusive, forms. How is an abuser formed? Well, an abuser is made, not born. That's an important fact. So there's no real genetic trace or psychological mental health problem to be traced to abuse. Yes, some of them interfere with abusive patterns, but abuse is an attitude that is learned, not something that you're born with. And it's an attitude that is learned from your parents or primary caregivers and reinforced inside your culture. From media, from friends, from secondary caregivers, and so on. The thing is, many of the items that today we would consider abusive, that we would consider as unequal inside a relationship that should be between equals, were not considered to be abusive, were actually considered to be a part of life, a part of the norm, only a generation or two ago. That's one of the bigger reasons why abuse exists, because genders had different roles for generations and men were on top. Of course, not only men can be abusive, women can be abusive as well, but they would have to grow up in an environment where they would learn this abuse, or either for example, their father was abusive and they connected with their father more, so they become abusive as well, or their mother was abusive and they learn it from their mother or primary caregiver, or in rarer cases, but it happens, they were simply spoiled and they pick up abusive tendencies, the idea of entitlement from that. But that doesn't change the fact that it's much easier in many cultures to breed a male abuser than it is to breed a female abuser. Do not give credence to the ideas that it's an equal-sided deal. There are many more men abusers than there are women. With potential examples from my father, who I learned recently is abusive. Shock of my life that was, because I have been studying abuse for the better part of 2 years, and only recently did I come to the realization, not through my own devices, but through somebody else sort of nudging me in that direction, that my own father was abusive. Just to show how difficult it can be from when you're inside an abusive relationship to recognize it. So what did my father pick up from his childhood? Well, my grandfather on my father's side was a very respected member of his community, and inside his home he was what was considered normal at the time, the king of his castle. My father picked up a few ideas from growing up. He picked up the idea that women inside the relationship should service him. They should take care of the home in its entirety, take care of cooking meals, cleaning clothes, and by and large work as a servant to satisfy his needs emotionally, sexually, physically, you name it. He also learned that women are somehow inferior. They are less intelligent and less capable. And those are the core values he picked up. He picked them up most likely at a very young age, and they got reinforced throughout his formative years. And as an adult, you simply have them. You do not question them, and you do not really verbalize them as such. They're simply there. He also picked up another aspect that is interesting with regards to most abusers. He picked up the idea that he should never really, the world is a jungle, is a mean place, and he should never really show any weakness or let anybody get too close to you emotionally, because possibly they would hurt you, or that's a big no-no. So as an adult, my father did just that, but he did it in a very subtle way. So while some abusers use overt direct tactics such as fighting and yelling to get their point across, my father used more subtle tactics such as simply disappearing. When there was work to be had around the house, it was implied that my mother had to do it, but that's because my father simply disappeared and shirked off any of the major work around the house. When it was time to pay the bills, my father simply ignored them and let my mother pay them. Now, of course, my mother felt this was completely unfair, and she brought it up. Whenever my mother would bring up any problems in the house, the favorite tactic was just stonewalling. Don't say anything, and after a while, act annoyed and disappear. So nothing would get solved, and she would be forced, because she had to run the household, somebody had to clean and so on, she would be forced to do all those things. And part of my mother's suffering under that form of abuse. So very important to note, stonewalling and refusing to engage in communication is also a form of abuse. Besides that, my father would do comments that would undermine your confidence, and that's in a very subtle way. You couldn't really pinpoint any one big blowout, but subtle things that I picked up. So I grew up with a relatively low self-confidence, and I wondered for many years why I had such low self-confidence that I tried to build up as an adult and shore up to an extent, but it was really a struggle. Because my father undermined my confidence in a subtle way and repeatedly throughout my childhood. My mother suffered greatly from a lack of self-confidence, and it was only when she discovered self-help books and went to some courses that gave her an outside source of reference that she discovered the gist of my father's abuse and started rebuilding her self-confidence by herself. He therefore expected that my mother would do the cleaning and cooking and paying all the bills, while he did mostly nothing. The money he was making, he would guard in a very specific manner. He would never share any money. You would never know how much money he would have. He would never let you get close to him. He would never share just the normal intimate things that couples share. He would never, for example, hold my mother's hand while in public. Sexually, he made no attempt to really please my mother or involve himself with a partner, but he did expect sexual satisfaction as a given right, and if it was not given to him, he allowed himself the privilege to have several affairs. It's a subtle form of abuse, and my mother for years thought that only if she could find a way to speak better, to let my father know that he's hurting her, then he would stop. And that's what many abuse victims go through. They internalize it. They think it's their problem, and they try to vary the approach. It took my mother about 10 years inside the marriage to realize that my father was not really willing to do these things. He was intentionally stonewalling. To summarize, an abuser learns the attitude from a very young age, and it's reinforced growing up, mainly from their primary caregivers and secondarily from friends, family, media, culture. It's not associated with any psychological disorder, but by the time they're adults, they develop their own style to achieve abuse, and the styles vary wildly. They're quite varied. Yeah. So you saw the example of my father, who happened to be arguably less severe or more subtle and more difficult to identify, and of course there's the ones that we typically identify as abuse, such as physical and yelling, but there's many more ways in which you manipulate.